Today I want to start out, we're going to cover a lot of things, like I said. In this stream, we're going to talk about the assassination of William McKinley, the origins of progressivism. Where did this idea come from? We're going to look at what progressivism looked like in the local and state. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, these are the three presidents that are considered progressive presidents. We're going to look at the causes of World War I just briefly. This is not world history. We're only going to learn about it in terms of the U.S. involvement, and then we're going to talk about the short-term and long-term effects of World War I. All right, so if you're on period 7, Jamie, thank you. If you guys are on period 7, that means that you've covered 80% of the exam. And what that also means is that period 7 is the most one of the most covered periods in AP US history. And this period is the one we're covering tonight. So if you're here, you're off to a great start. Even if you haven't seen the progressive era, or if you already went past it, this is a great review because this is a period that comes up and is tested frequently on the AP exam. So first, we're going to start with the assassination of William McKinley. But before we start, let me see if you guys know this. What number president is William McKinley? 25th. All right. And he's kind of like this president that you really need to remember that he's the 25th president, because he's going to be the president that's going to essentially, after his assassination, you usher in the 20th century. So he's an important president to remember because he's basically the connector of the 19th and 20th century. So remember, he's the 25th president. So William McKinley, during the election of 1896, he runs against this man named William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan is kind of famous because he runs for everything and he loses everything. And silver, exactly, Dakota. He runs for president a bunch of times. He does all these things and he never wins. And that's kind of what he's famous for. But in that year, William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan are running for president. And some of the richest men in the country, they fear William Jennings Bryan because they believe that he's going to come after them. And so they put all their energy into helping elect William McKinley because they see him as a pro-business friendly president. So they favor his policies, and with the help of big business, William McKinley becomes the 25th president of the United States. He wins all these red states here, and Bryan carries all the blue states. So there you are, Dakota. William McKinley there would have won Texas there. California, you would have voted for McKinley there. Kind of strange now to see the map is actually the other way around, because the red states are typically what we call blue now, and the blue states are what we call red. And so William McKinley wins the election of 1896, and then he wins again in 1900. He runs again against William Jennings Bryan. So William McKinley beats him in 1896, and in 1900, he beats him. One main thing changes, though. In 1900, William McKinley picks a man named Theodore Roosevelt to be his vice president. So William McKinley becomes the 25th president of the United States. Roosevelt becomes the vice president of the United States. And basically, they use Theodore Roosevelt to go around the country advertising William McKinley. He goes there, gives all these speeches, and he's like the spokesman for William McKinley. Well, back then, they used to think that the vice presidency was kind of this place where you had no power. You weren't president, and you really just did nothing. And when Theodore Roosevelt becomes vice president, he's kind of useless in a way, and he's frustrated by this. And somebody said, but Theodore Roosevelt at that time, he was kind of seen like a crazy person, like a guy who would do extreme things. And so somebody famously said, "Are you serious? You're going to put Theodore Roosevelt as vice president? He's one heartbeat away from the presidency." And those were. So William McKinley standing in line, and all these people are standing in line. This man has a handkerchief, walks up to William McKinley and shoots him. Once in the chest, he shoots him again. And once he's going to take the third shot, he's tackled here in the back by a large black man, and he's taken to the ground. And William McKinley, he falls to the ground, and his first words as he's been shot, He says, be careful how you tell my wife. So, Dakota, that's an excellent question. So, if you remember in the election of 1896, William McKinley, correct, he was an anarchist, but William McKinley had been pushed to the White House by the richest man in the country. And the man who assassinated him had lost his job in one of those factories. And he saw William McKinley as being responsible for the fact that he lost his job. So for him, this assassination attempt was to fix a wrong that had gone on in his life. So he walks up, he shoots him, and the doctors that night, they rush over to William McKinley. William McKinley is shot. He dies 8 days later. And that is essentially the origins of progressivism. The death of William McKinley marks the beginning of progressivism. And so that's a good phrase to remember for you guys. If you're writing a DBQ, if you're writing an FRQ, and you're able to just kind of say that the death of William McKinley ushers in progressivism, that's something that's going to get you some points there. So, all right. So, you guys still with me? Thumbs up? Correct, Dakota. So, the death of William McKinley ushers in Theodore Roosevelt, who's the first progressive president. All right, guys. You guys are awesome. All right. So, I want to show you this visual here. This is the first progressive president. And so what number president is Theodore Roosevelt here? So McKinley was 20. All right, there you go. And that's an important number because he's going to be one of the best presidents in American history. He's actually in Mount Rushmore, if I'm correct. Oh, I should know that for sure. Yes, he is. All right. So here's Theodore Roosevelt. He ushers in this progressive era. And the way I remember it, and I teach my students, is to think of progressivism as the root word is progress. So the idea is that progress moves you forward. Progressivism was trying to move the country forward. So progressivism, progress. All right, that's a good way, a mnemonic device to remember it. So during the century, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And he does it in a time when there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of monopolies, there's abuse of workers, and there's concentration of wealth in the hands of few people. And so when he takes over, he says, I'm going to fix these injustices. And Theodore Roosevelt is a man that a lot of people said couldn't be bought. There's times that people would, there's stories that J.P. Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller would send their men to Roosevelt and say, go ask the president what he wants. How much money does he want to help us out? And they would go to the president. He's like, I can't be bought. Tell these guys I can't be bought. And that tells you what kind of person Roosevelt was. All right. So this is very important. So if you're writing something down, I need you to write this down to remember it. So there are 4 goals for progressivism. The first goal was social welfare. The second goal was moral improvement. The third goal was economic reform. And then the fourth goal was to foster efficiency. Now, let's look at this goal real quick. What did social welfare mean? That many social welfare reformers worked to soften some of the harsh conditions of industrialization. Industrialization had made life really, really hard. And these social reformers wanted to fix that. So they started organizations like the YMCA. Does anybody know what the YMCA stand for? And no, it's not a... What does the YMCA stand for? Perfect, Dakota. Exactly. The Young Man's Christian Association. And this was a place where kids could go and have fun and play and escape some of the struggles of the Industrial Revolution. They also started the Salvation Army. One of the key people in the social reform movement is this woman named Florence Kelley. The next was moral improvement. So reformers during this time, they felt morally responsible to help the poor, that there were a lot of and they needed to help them. So 2 organizations were started, the Women's Christian Temperance, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. 2 key people are Frances Willard and carry nation. Next was economic reform. How do you fix the economy that has produced so many poor people? So people started, one of the goals of progressivism was to promote Americans who questioned the value of capitalism. Some American workers began to embrace socialism. They said, capitalism doesn't work. Look at how much money these people have. Here's how much money we have. This is not working. And some of these people that began to challenge the capitalist system were known as the Muckrakers, and they were doing it through a magazine called McClure Magazine. Some of the most famous people, a socialist named UGV Debs, Ida M. Tarbell, and Upton Sinclair. Now, UGV Debs, this is kind of like a modern day guy who's running for president. Who is this guy who's running for president who just won New Hampshire? Does anybody know? All right, Dakota, you're on fire there, all right? You're on fire. It's Bernie Sanders. And I feel like Eugene V. Debs is kind of like a Bernie Sanders. He was a socialist. He was not really, not hugely popular during this time, although Bernie Sanders is proven to be popular. But he had these ideas that were somewhat radical for his time. And the final thing were to foster efficiency. Leaders put their faith in experts and scientific principles. They said, we can make things better and we can make things faster. And so they began to look at how they can make the workplace faster. This is the idea under scientific management. And one of the proponents of scientific management was this man named Frederick Winslow Taylor. And the champion of scientific management was Henry Ford in the assembly line. So here were the 4 goals. So I'm perfect. Social welfare or reform, perfect. Improving working conditions, economic reform. Working conditions fell under kind of like this social or moral improvement, correct? What was another one? So we have social welfare, foster efficiency, this idea that we can make things better. There was one more. Oh, you guys got it. You're correct. Social welfare, moral improvement, economic reform, and to foster efficiency. All right. So this is going to be very important for you guys to remember as when you talk about the progressive era, they're talking about these 4 goals and where people were working within these 4 goals. So that's very important. So let's look at what progressivism, what these progressives were trying to do in the local and then the state levels. And then we're going to look at the national level. So cities were facing many problems during that time associated with the Industrial Revolution. What were some of the problems? I know you guys have learned about this. What were some of the problems associated with the Industrial Revolution that were produced? All right, exactly. Unsanitary work environments, child labor, Dakota, awesome. Long hours, short pay. How about where people lived? All right, exactly. The slums, Kimberly. Usually it's called the tenement housing, the production of the slums. Exactly. They lived in these small little houses, really crowded. It could be 4 or 5 people in a 1-bed. They were working in unsafe conditions. There was child labor, long working hours, and this is by workers. So cities were facing problems. One of them was political, where these political bosses took over the cities. And they would basically say, vote for me and I'm going to take care of you. And they would reward their supporters. They would give kickbacks for votes. That means like, hey, vote for me and I'm going to give you something. That's called a bribe, which is illegal. It's corruption. They would buy votes. They would, when there were natural disasters, they would not take care of the people. They would mismanage the taking care of the people for natural disasters. I'll give you an example. There was just a natural disaster in California, the fires. And one of the purposes of government is to take care of the citizens when there are natural disasters. Well, in that era, those people were failing to take care of their citizens. And we're going to look at 2 examples. And finally, the utilities, which everybody uses, like electricity, water, sanitation, they were privately owned. And so there were some issues with that. So progressivism at the local level aimed to fix these problems. How did they do it? Well, first, at the local level, they set up city commissions. In 1900, there was a hurricane in Galveston, Texas. So Dakota, this is some history for you there. And hundreds of people died. And not only that, that the response to the hurricane was a disaster. And so the government set up a commission. And these commissions, when there's a problem, they set these commissions that started to spread to other cities. So this is one of the ways they did this. They took control from the local government and they set up commissions. Another way was by city councils. Every city that I can think of, I may, off the top of my head, has a city council. You have local government. And what that did was, this came after the Dayton flood in 1913, where now people could vote for their city council people. There are people in the city that are running to make laws. They're also, how did they clean up local government? They reformed the tax system. Fair tax structure, lower public transportation, and relief for the unemployed. And so they wanted, remember, progressivism is progress. They wanted to fix the tax structure and help the unemployed. These were problems that were created from the Industrial Revolution. And finally, in Cleveland, Ohio, they began converting all the public utilities into all the private utilities into publicly owned enterprises. Why? Because these are public services that everybody uses. It doesn't help us if we have private companies running these public utilities. So that's one way that they started to fix. Correct. Yes. Okay. So that was one way they started to fix local government. Now let's look at national government. So just like local cities were facing problems with industrialization, so were the states. And the states, they were having high corruption rates in politics. Corporations can influence politics and buy power. This is a huge obstacle for a democracy. There were abuses of child worker. There were abuses of the workers' rights. People were killed or hurt at work, and basically nothing happened to the employers. And there were abuses by elected officials. So what did they do? They passed a couple laws at the state level. One was to protect children. An example of this is the Keaton-Owen Act of 1916. This act tried to make it illegal if you made a product using children, you couldn't sell that product in another state. And so this was a way to stop companies from using child labor. Another one, in Mueller versus Oregon in 1908, they limited the number of hours women could work to 10 hours a workday. Remember, there were abuses of workers during that time. This changed it. They also began the reforming process for elections. You could recall, you could referendum, and you can initiate. What does this mean? That when we can put things on the ballot. In California, there's things on the ballot all the time. This is part of the reforming elections, that people can influence government by getting things on the ballot. And finally, the direct election of senators through the passage of the 17th Amendment. Now, we just went through a lot of stuff, guys. So for this part that I want you to remember, and that I think is important, is that there were seen at the city level, and progressivism could be seen at the state level. One of the things is you want to try to remember one of the things, how it was viewed, how progressivism was acted in the local level. So any of these will do. All right. So one of the things that I want you to remember for this part is that there were efforts at the local level and at the state level. You don't have to remember all these examples, but you should remember one. You should be able to provide at least one example of how progressivism was seen at the state level and how progressivism was seen at the local level. Okay? Why? Because that's how you substantiate an argument in AP US history. You have to give an example. So, for example, if I'm talking about at the state level, how is progressivism seen at the state level? I can talk about the 17th Amendment. Okay? And I would talk about how they began electing senators to give people more control over politics. All right, guys. Here's a couple examples. So another way that it was influenced at the state level or national level as well was through these people called the Muckrakers. What were Muckrakers? All right. There were people. What kind of people, Mufas? There were journalists. Kelly, good job. There were journalists whose main job was to expose, just like Mufas said, big corruption. Not only corruption in business, but in all areas of American life. So Ida Tarbell, she wrote a book about the ruthlessness of J.D. Rockefeller and how he was building trust. What is a trust? Exactly. All right, perfect. That's a good question, Dakota. All right, Mufas gave you the answer there. It's a trust is another name for a monopoly. It's a big company that owns Mufos, correct? Mufos? Mafus? Mafus. It's a company that owns many other companies. Mafus. All right, Mafus. Thank you, Mafus. And then we have another man named Lincoln Stevens, who's the leading figure of the muckraker movement. He writes for McClure magazine. And finally, one of the most famous muckrakers is this man named Upton Sinclair, who writes a book called The Jungle. And here he exposes the conditions that immigrants are working and the unsanitary conditions that meatpacking industry. So all the meat that people were eating, he wrote about how essentially that was being treated. It was on the floor next to the bathroom. People were walking over it, and then they were selling it, and I was eating it. All right. People at that, well, not I, but people in that era were eating it. And I was extremely nasty and unsanitary. And so he exposed that, which is going to lead to another progressive reform. So now we are going to look at the Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But real quick, let's go back. What are the 4 goals of progressivism? Quick, give me one. Social reform, moral improvement, and Kimberly fostering efficiency. Exactly. All right. So give me one example of how progressivism could be seen at the local level. All right. There we go. Tax reforms. My favorite one, to be honest, to remember is that they set up a city council, which we still do. So that's a progressive reform, the setting up of a city council. What is an example of a progressive reform at the state level? The recall, exactly. Perfect. Good job, Dakota. All right, exactly. The 17th Amendment. So, guys, that's what's going to get you points there, okay? Being able to name protecting children. McKinsey, perfect. If you can name the act, the Keaton-Owen Act in 1916, I know that's tough to remember, but that's really a way to show your depth of knowledge, okay? But you're exactly right. That was one of the reforms, progressive reforms. All right, now we're going to look at the presidents. So this man right here is Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States. And he comes up when he becomes president after McKinley's assassination. He says, we must treat each man on his worth and merits as a man. We must see that each is given a square deal because he is entitled to no more and should receive no less. Why do you think Roosevelt would call his progressive reforms a square, like a square deal? What's so unique about a square? All right, Dakota, you're on fire there. All right, awesome. It's equal on all sides. And so he's saying if we're going to change things, it has to be equal for all sides. What does that mean? It has to be equal for labor. This is very important, guys. So please, if you're writing something down, write this down. Theodore Roosevelt comes up with the square deal. And he basically says it should be equal for labor, for consumers, for businesses, and for the environment. For labor, he says, well, they should be able to form unions. And when there's a strike, he would support arbitration, which is the discussing between the employer and the union. He says we should protect consumers, the people like you and me that are buying these things. And so there should be safety and health inspections. An example is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. He even says things should be fair for businesses. Yes, they should be able to grow, but they shouldn't be able to monopolize. So he begins something called trust busting, filing lawsuits to break up these huge monopolies. Imagine if McDonald's owns Burger King and In-N-Out and and I don't know, another hamburger joint. This is called a monopoly, and that's illegal. You can't own everybody. You can't own all the competition. And this is what was happening during that time. So Theodore Roosevelt begins trust busting. And finally, he says we need to protect the environment for future generations. An example of this is the Antiquities Act of 1906. What did this do? It aimed to protect the land for future generations. So it allowed Theodore Roosevelt to put put protections on public lands and make public parks. And so if you look at this square deal here, he wanted to protect labor, he wanted to protect the consumers, protect the other businesses and businesses that were trying to start up, and he wanted to protect the environment. All right? All right, Dakota, perfect. We're going to talk about that because Theodore Roosevelt, so Dakota asked, what is the difference between the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act? So the Sherman Antitrust Act comes first. It's the first attempt to limit monopolies, but it's not strong enough. And so later on, they're going to pass the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is essentially the same thing, except the Clayton Antitrust Act is stronger. That's a great question. After Theodore Roosevelt, he becomes president. He leaves. He says, you should elect my man, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was a very large man, over 300 pounds. And there's a famous story that he was in the bathtub and he got stuck in the bathtub. I don't know if that's true. All right, guys. So I was just talking about William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft was appointed. Well, he kind of got the thumbs up from Theodore Roosevelt and said, you should be my predecessor. And he becomes president. And William Howard Taft has a famous little saying. He says, when people call him Mr. President, he turns around and kind of looks around and says, where's Theodore Roosevelt? And what does that tell you about how Taft felt about being president? If every time somebody calls him president, he looks for Roosevelt, what does that tell you about how he felt? All right. Perfect. Exactly. He felt like he did not live up to the role. Like he was not president. It should be somebody else. Mafus, very good. And when William Howard Taft becomes president, he's the second progressive president. And he continues on with political reforms. He wants to limit the power of big corporations, and he files a number of antitrust lawsuits, more than Roosevelt. And he favors the passage of the 16th and 17th Amendment. 16th is tax reform, 17th is the election of senators. He also favors economic reforms. Although he campaigned on lowering tariffs, he actually ends up doing something different when he's president, which is going to make him somewhat unpopular. And finally, he continues the reforms started by Roosevelt to protect national forests, and he expands to protect wildlife refuges. That means where there's animals that are, I would say, coming close to extinct or endangered, he creates the reforms that we can protect those animals. Exactly. Correct. Awesome. And then finally, we have Woodrow Wilson. What number president is Woodrow Wilson? So if McKinley was 25, what's Woodrow Wilson? 27, 28. All right. He is the 28th president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, before becoming president, he was a college professor and a college president. He's what we call an intellectual. He's an intellectual president. Correct, Kimberly. Dakota, I know exactly how you're feeling. I am not a huge fan of Woodrow Wilson either. Partly because he had some really, really racist views. He was known, even by the standards of his day, he was considered to be a racist. And so I have some anyway. I don't want to get into it, but you're right. Woodrow Wilson is not one of my top lists there. But he continues the progressive reforms. There was the question about the Clayton Antitrust Act. Well, he uses the Clayton Antitrust Act to go after trust. And remember, this is a little bit more powerful than the Sherman Antitrust Act. So he begins to actually continue the tradition of trust busting. And during his time, he begins to see that women are looking for the right to vote. And under his presidency, the 19th Amendment is passed. So we talked about the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment. We're going to talk about the 18th and the 19th Amendment. Okay? The 19th Amendment is the amendment that gave the women the right to vote. He also passes economic reforms such as the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and he helps establish the Federal Reserve System, which we still use today. And then finally, he saw the passage of the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition. What is prohibition? Exactly. It made alcohol legal. And this is an example of how they wanted to clean up society, of the idea that if you make alcohol illegal, people would, society could be cleaned up. So this happened under Woodrow Wilson. All right, guys. So now we're headed towards the home stretch. We got about 12 minutes left, and then we're going to wrap it up. You guys have been an amazing audience. I want to thank you guys. First, Dakota, Kimberly, McKinsey, Mafus, all you guys for staying with me. I know I've been having Kelly, thank you. I've been having some Jocelyn. I've been having some technical difficulties, but thank you guys. All right. So World War I. The best way to remember the causes of World War I are through an acronym called MANIA. M stands for militarism. A stands for alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the assassination. And I'm not going to go through it all. I would recommend that you screenshot this one because this is something that's going to help you just kind of remember the causes of World War I. The main cause is, in my opinion, is the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. When he's traveling after his assassination and the assassination of his wife, it begins essentially World War I. And so the death of one person began a world war. And so after he's assassinated, the United States at that point is not in the war. Why? Because they are not part of the system of alliances. All these countries during that time, they promised they were going to help each other, and they created these alliances. Like, just like with your friends, like, hey, if you fight that guy, I'm going to help you out. This is what was going on with these European countries. The United States was not part of this system of alliances. Why? This is the million-dollar question there, guys. Why was the United States not part? Which president warned us not to be part of an alliance system? All right, Daniela, you're right on. 500 points. There you go. George Washington himself. Exactly, Jocelyn. Great job. Shout out to your teachers because they did a great job. Exactly. George Washington himself said, don't do this. And that worked all the way up to World War I, when essentially after the war, we are going to join a system of alliances. So why did the U.S. get involved in World War I? We know the causes are mania. And why did they get involved? Well, Wilson calls at the beginning of the war, he calls for peace without victory, that we can have a peace. Dakota, you're right on. All right. You got this, guys. So Wilson calls for peace. But the Germans, they continue this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. And Germany, exactly, yes. You're going to see that the United States at this time, they're delivering goods. They want to be neutral, and they want to deliver goods to both countries that are fighting. Well, Germany says, we're not going to allow that. If we see a submarine, we don't care who it is, we're going to sink it. Or if we see a ship, we're going to sink it. And to make matters worse, Germany sends a telegram to Mexico that says, if you join, then the Lusitania, correct? Yes. If you join, that we will help you beat the United States in a war. And the United States read this and they said, well, Germany's trying to turn Mexico against us. This is essentially a declaration of war. And the last thing is that Russia withdraws from the war, which the U.S. sees if they join the war, now they're protecting democracy. And democracy is a cause worth dying for, according to Wilson here. So going back, the Zimmerman telegram, this Zimmerman note that is intercepted says, Mexico joined the war against us, and if you fight the United States, we will help you. And this angers the United States. And in 1917, the United States declares war. So World War I, does anybody know the dates for World War I? This is kind of important. All right, Dakota, 1914 and 1918. So the United States essentially joins in the last year of the war. Well, what happens in this war? So let's look here. First, the United States, it changes. It changes how people are living in the United States. We become a war economy. That means everything we're producing is to win the war. Food, save your food, don't waste it because they're soldiers. We got to send everything to the war. Anti-immigrant hysteria. That means people begin to fear immigrants, especially German immigrants. In 1917 and 1918, they passed two acts, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which are targeted towards immigrants and really limit the civil liberties of people. And finally, the Great Migration. African Americans, they begin to move to the north to take on these jobs to help for the war. And they escape the South because the South at that time is suffering from racism. And so African Americans move to the north. Finally, the United States spends $3.5 billion on the war, and they begin to push for propaganda. That means communication, trying to get people to support the war. At the end, so those were the short-term effects. The long-term effects are that Wilson argues for his 14 points. Remember, the United States was only in the war for 2 years. And Wilson comes in and says, you know what? I know best. I'm going to help you set the terms for peace. And he advocates for 14 points of peace. One of them was the establishment of the League of Nations. This kind of like all these countries coming together. And if everybody's together, then we can solve conflicts and avoid wars. Well, the Treaty of Versailles angers a lot of people, including the Germans. And after the war, there's this rise of, in the United States, like, let's just go back to things when things were normal. I mean, we've done all these things. Let's just have fun. And this is where the 1920s really begin this return to normalcy. And finally, the last thing here is you have a generation of writers. They're called the lost generations of writers. And they're impacted by the war and the tremendous amount of life that was lost. And they're called the lost generation. And some of the most famous is Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. What book did F. Scott Fitzgerald write that you guys have to read every year? Okay, so Che, this is a really good question. One of the main things that you need to remember about the article, especially for AP US history, they're not going to ask you for specific information about the Treaty of Versailles. What they are going to ask you is about the League of Nations, and specifically the Wilson's 14 points to establish a League of Nations. And so Article 10 is the members of the League undertake to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. And so basically this is saying when there's a problem, we are going to come together and solve it. And it was an idea that was aimed to solve the issues of war. Yes, Dakota, exactly. And Che, I'm sorry, I kind of butchered that, but just understand that the League of Nations was formed as a collective way to solve problems, which is what Article 10 deals with. And yes, the Homestead Strike does deal with the progressive era at that time. Yes, that is one of the ways that it challenged the progressive thinking that unions could be allowed and so on. If I remember, what is the year for the Homestead Strike? I want to make sure okay, so it's 1892. The Homestead Strike is 1892. So you could say that this was right at the beginning of the progressive era. So guys, I want to do some questions real quick. So I want to do some questions here just to check for understanding, to see how you guys see how you guys did. What were the 4 goals of progressivism? I come back to it because it's a great way to review. So real quick, put one goal of the 4 goals. Social welfare, economic reform, social reform. Starts with an M. Foster efficiency and moral reform. All right. Who were the 3 progressive presidents? Perfect. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And it's important to remember them in that order because it can get confusing because they also have foreign policy. So it's Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Correct. So real quick, what was one of the progressive reforms done at the local level? All right, Dakota, you got it. That's it. After the Dayton flood, there was the development of a city council. That's it. You got the point. City commissions. What was one of the reforms done at the state level? Perfect, Che. The private utilities were changed. At the state level, the recall and the 17th Amendment, the Keaton-Owens Acts, which limited child labor. Perfect. Guys, perfect. All right. I got a couple more questions. What was the acronym? Sorry, let me go back. What was the acronym that was used for this that explains the causes of World War I? Mania. All right, what does this stand for? MANIA. What does this stand for? Military, militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the last one. Perfect. What was the name of the telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico? The Zimmerman telegram. What year did the United States join the war? Perfect. 1917. You guys are killing it. All right. And real quick, tell me real quick, which president issued the square deal? Roosevelt. Perfect. Which president was assassinated that gave Roosevelt the presidency? McKinley. All right, you guys are killing this, guys. I'm so proud of you guys. I got this. The last thing I just kind of want to go over here is remember that the United States, that in the home front, there were some changes to the United States. And this is important. I'm not covering that as much here, but just know that the war had an impact on the United States in terms of the jobs, the economy, and anti-immigrant hysteria. All right, guys, first, I just want to thank you guys. Remember, next Thursday, there's a stream at 9 p.m. Eastern time for AP US History. I'm so grateful for you guys. Thank you for joining me tonight. All right, Dakota, guys, all you guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys have a great week. Tomorrow's Friday. Enjoy it and have a great time. I give a shout out to all your teachers. Cindy, hey, awesome to have you back. Hey, I love having you guys, and thank you for hanging in with me for the technical difficulties. Good night, guys.